even with that being the case. So thank you all for being here. I want to do some introductions this time because while we do have some regular Arizona user group people, we also have some visitors. So if anyone would like to introduce yourself, that would be great. I am Jeremy, and I, along with Gordon, help run the group. Gordon's waving right now. Anyone else like to introduce themselves?
You've already introduced me.
Hey, I am.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to try to make a joke, but it was not going to be very funny. But I am universally unique. See,
I get it.
Like, yeah, there you go. All right.
Peter Adams. I have a small development agency locally here in Arizona, working on launching a new product. I actually registered my second LLC last week, so I'm getting ready to launch a new product. See where that all goes. Targeting real estate investors, property managers, competing with something like AppFolio and Buildium, that kind of stuff. So building on PHP, Symfony, Puppeteer, whole bunch of stuff. So I've been writing PHP for like 20 some odd years, and I make use of UUID actually. So thank you, Ben.
I was going to say really quick, if you happen to have job openings or are looking for a job, please make sure to mention that as you introduce yourself. And I should probably mention that I have guests here from my company, McGraw-Hill. They're Tim Bond, Bryce Bentler, and Amit. He can probably say his last name better than I can. So what was it? Oh, you're on mute.
Oh yeah, I always do that. I either close my camera or my mic by mistake. It's pronounced as Deshmukh, so you always get it right, don't worry. Yeah, why not I introduce myself? So my name is Amit Deshmukh. I'm kind of just another backend engineer trying to learn different skills. And hopefully by joining these meetups, I get more exposure. My first experience with PHP was when I joined McGraw-Hill as an intern, and that got me interested and always wanted to learn more in that field. But basically, I'm writing Go code at my day-to-day job. Yep, that's all about me. And I'm based in Los Angeles, so not from Arizona.
I'll say hi. I'm Chris. I'm a passionate PHP developer, a bit of a Linux junkie, PC gamer, I love coffee, and nothing around the job front, but just hi. Welcome everybody that's new.
Hi, Josh Eichhorn. I don't know, just been doing PHP for 20 plus years. I think actually 20 years of going to azPHP. So it's been a long time doing these meetups. And my company, Pagely, we have an opening right now for a full stack engineer. And we're also thinking about listing a PHP/Go backend engineer. So if you're interested in either of those, just ping me and I can give you some more details.
Hi, Ray Boharts, work for a company called Salucra Healthcare Solutions. Been doing PHP for, I think, about 10 years now. I think that's about right. Yeah, not much more to say except I enjoy these meetups.
My name is Jill. I've worked with PHP since 2011, about 10 years now. Last couple of years, I've been working at an agency doing custom WordPress themes and plugins. So.
I'm John. I work with Josh and Gordon at Pagely, and it's awesome. If anyone wants to join the team. And these meetings are great too. Thanks.
Okay. Did anyone else want to introduce himself? Otherwise, 3, 2, 1. Otherwise, we'll keep going. Hey, John, welcome.
Hey, how you doing?
Since we're doing introductions right now, and you just popped on right at the very end, so if you want to introduce yourself, here's your chance.
My name's John Bell. I live in Arcadia. I'm doing mostly C# programming for my father's company right now. I've been doing PHP for 15 years. So it's good to see all of you tonight.
Awesome. Thanks. Good to see you too. All right. I will say that our meetup is sponsored by Pagely. They provide our Zoom account for the meetups and also hosted us at their co-working space when we were in person. And so we're always thankful to them for their support. If you want to talk outside of the meetups, a lot of us are on the AZ Devs Slack workspace. We have a PHP channel. Sometimes the azdevs.org website works and lets you register for the Slack workspace. If not, let me or Gordon know and we'll get you in there. But we'd love to see you in there. Not too many announcements tonight. We're going to continue online meetups until further notice, but hopefully with the vaccines and things happening, well, maybe sometime this year, we'll see. I don't know. We mentioned this at the beginning. Josh did another PHP 8.1 RFC made it through, and that is the Fibers RFC. I think Gordon wanted to talk about this at the end of the meetup too, if people are sticking around. So that's an interesting one for sure if you haven't checked it out. All right, and now the trivia question. So if you know the answer, please write it in the chat. What is the operator with the lowest precedence in PHP? Any other guesses?
This is a trick question.
Yeah, it's kind of
not really. Not really.
I guess it's not, but
it's a tricky question.
It's
Jeremy
tricky.
likes trick questions.
Trick questions are how you learn the most, because then you have to look it up later and read more about it. All right, let's see what we got here. We have plus, minus, throw, and all of those are wrong. Sorry. The answer is or, and not the 2 lines or, but the actual word or, which is not a commonly used operator. But you can read about operator precedence in the manual here. It's got the whole list all the way down with or at the very bottom.
They don't have throw in that list.
They don't. But that's technically an operator now that it's in an expression, right?
Yeah. Arrow functions are also have precedence as well, even though I don't think they're considered operators.
Time to update the docs, I guess.
I'll post a link as to where I'm getting that from, because the only reason I mentioned that's tricky is because they just added the throw operator. I think it's
That's
the
true.
lowest one, but it's in the source code where you can get this list.
Yep.
So I'll post that
I'd be
link.
surprised if it's the lowest, but I'm happy to be proven wrong.
But yeah, that's a tricky thing with that and or there, because they have lower precedence than the logical and the other logical and ors.
Yep.
So like there's this funky thing. Let me see if I've got this example handy. If I don't, I'll just shut up. But where is it? This is just fresh in my mind because I'm writing a book about it right now. So that's why I have it handy. I'm not that smart. Oh, never mind. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of a different tricky thing.
Oh, okay.
The or has a lower precedence than even the assignment operator.
Yes.
So this is where the tricky thing comes in. I'll post it in chat. If you try doing something like this, see what happens.
Yeah. Yep.
Nice.
So what I saw, it was popular for a short period of time amongst some group of people, was where you have something like this.
Yes.
So, do this or just bail, or die. And I think everyone liked it because it said or die. But yeah, it's not the most popular thing in the current PSR standards. I think outlaw the use of these operators, if I remember right.
I think so too. Yeah.
So anyway, read up on your operator precedents. All right, so tonight I'm going to talk about building Slack apps in PHP. So I'm going to switch over to my other deck here. And this is a brand new, very unpolished presentation with lots of live coding that could go wrong. So that is my disclaimer for tonight. But hopefully very early in this presentation, we'll be able to create our first Slack application that won't do a whole lot, but it will be functional and it will work end to end through Slack. So what is Slack? Most of you are either using this already or have at least heard of it. But it's this decade's chat program of choice, it seems like, especially for business and especially for tech businesses. It does a lot of things, including custom integrations or apps. So how popular is Slack? It's pretty popular. These are the numbers I pulled from the website. So if you trust their website, this is the numbers that show just kind of how widespread usage of Slack is. I believe those numbers because it's pretty popular. We use it at McGraw-Hill, for example. It's all over the place. So what is a Slack app? I wasn't able to come with a good solid definition of that because it's kind of just, I would say it's any custom bot utility workflow or integration that you integrate with Slack. So what does that mean? It means that an app can use Slack's event stream for things that are going on in the application. Slack has APIs, so an app can call those APIs. Slack has interactive components like form controls, and so those trigger things that would go to your app that you can process. There's webhooks that can trigger things in an app, or that an app can use to trigger other things. Or it can just be a customization that calls out to third-party services. So there's lots of things you can do in an app. What does it mean for the people building apps and building products? It means that you can surface your product in some kind of meaningful way into Slack for other people to use. So we're going to build our first Slack app right now, and it's going to take 6 steps. So, I actually might need someone to read me these steps. Who's going to be my volunteer step reader?
I could do it.
Awesome.
What do you need?
Thank you. Let me, I'll drop this into chat for you. Okay. So
Okay.
let's do this. All right. What am I doing first?
Step number 1, visit https://api.slack.com/apps and create a new app config.
Okay. So I had that page loaded. The only thing that you need really to have access to this is a Slack account and some kind of workspace that allows you to do it. And you can create your own workspace, which is what I did. So I'm going to create a new app. We're going to call this Hello. And when you create an app, you have to choose a default workspace because your Slack account can be associated with multiple. So we're going to use this test one that I made. And now we have an app, or at least a container or configuration for an app. So what's next?
Step 2, create a simple app locally as an index.php file.
All right, let's give that a shot. I need to switch my screen over to the other side. Did that work?
Yes.
All right.
You see your editor.
All right. Guess what our first Slack app's going to be? Just this. That's all. All right. Oops. There we go. What is the next step?
Step 3, use the PHP built-in server to serve it and Ngrok to expose it.
All right. So we haven't done this before. PHP comes with a built-in server that's very, very simple and not for production use. Quick, a port number.
9000.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay. We have it running on a port. Now, who's Has anyone heard of Ngrok? I'm assuming at least a few people have.
Yep.
So Ngrok is a SSH tunneling program, I guess you call it, but it allows you to expose a port running on your local machine to the internet, and they create a proxy to that for you. So I'm going to expose my port 9000, and I need this URL here. Okay. All right, what is next?
Configure a /hey/ command in your app config to point to the URL Ngrok created.
Okay, so I'm gonna go back to Slack here, into my app container. I'm going to create a / command. So this, we'll call it hey, and whenever someone in my workspace types /hey, it's going to send something to my application that's running through this Ngrok tunnel. And oops, it should hook up to Slack. What is going on with that? Oh, okay. All right, we have a / command. Now what?
We need to install the app to your workspace from the app config sidebar.
All right, that's right here. When you have a default workspace, the Slack lets you just install it into that workspace without having to create an entire OAuth flow. So it set that up now. And now what?
Step 6, type /hey into a channel in your Slack workspace.
Sweet. All right. Hey. Ta-da! Anyone impressed by that?
Thoroughly impressed. Thoroughly.
So, yeah, I mean, that is the most basic Slack app you could ever hope to make. But the point is that it was not that hard to get that initial integration set up. So let's go back and talk about this some more. All right, so what exactly did we accomplish here? We have Slack, we have our app, and we got this initial integration where Slack sends a payload to us, to our app, and we respond. And the response to Slack, they like to refer to it as the ACK. And that's it. We received the communication from Slack and we sent one back. All right, so what next? Well, we haven't done anything with authentication, so anyone could have sent a payload to our application and it would have done something. In fact, should probably turn that off. Also, we didn't really do anything with any data that was sent to us. We just kind of ignored it all and just echoed something back. So we need to deal with the specific payload that was sent to us. And then we need to actually do things that are meaningful. So we need to call Slack APIs. We need to use their webhooks. We can use our own APIs or third-party APIs. right now we're just echoing hello world, which is not useful, of course. So what's interesting is when I drew this chart out, it looked familiar. It's essentially the MVC pattern where the view is Slack.
Are you supposed to be showing a chart? I don't see a chart.
What are you looking at right now?
Slack.
Oh my gosh, I am so sorry. Thank you for letting me know. I thought I switched back here. All right.
Okay. Now we see
That
your
better?
slides.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, like I was saying, we have Slack. It sent us a payload to our app. We sent the ACK, or the response, back to Slack. And so we have authentication that we haven't implemented yet. We have payload specific logic we haven't implemented, and we have a whole bunch of things that we could potentially do from our application that we haven't implemented either. So that's where we should focus next. And yeah, basically the whole Slack app scenario is kind of like an MVC app where Slack is the view, our application code is the controller, and the model can be basically any type of state that we modify through what we're doing. I don't really like to think of it that way because it's not really the words that the Slack documentation uses. Some words that they do use are these. So surfaces, which are basically, or we're going to cover what these are. Surfaces, interactions, and reactions. So the bulk of what our app is doing is we're reacting to things. So everything that we do in our app is a reaction. So if you look at Slack app development in those three terms, basically a surface is anywhere an app can express itself through communication or interaction. So anything in the app, messages, modals, everything that we're doing in the app is essentially a surface. An interaction is basically something that happens in a surface that can be reacted to by our application. And then the reaction is what our app actually does. And usually what our app does is something that affects one of the services, either creating a new one or modifying an existing one. So with services, there's three main types. There are messages, and there's modals, and there's something called an app home. And when we look at a demo app, I'll point out which of these are where when we open that up. And all surfaces are defined using something called BlockKit in Slack, and something called Slack Markdown, which is kind of like Markdown that you might be used to, but it's Slack's flavor of it, and for that reason, I guess they dropped the vowels in that word. Slack provides a tool that's actually pretty cool to help understand BlockKit better. So I wanted to show that. And it's called the BlockKit Builder. And I guess I didn't have that one open yet. So here we go. All right, so BlockKit represents a surface, either a message modal or the app home screen for your app. So we'll look at messages first because that's the one that's kind of easiest to understand. And a message can be composed of blocks. And there's different types of blocks available. So there's a section, which is a section of content. There's actions, which contain interactive components, dividers, simple images, context, which is a smaller content section I'll show you, and then headers. So we could put a header in first, for example, and then it draws out the rendering of it, what it'll look like in Slack, and also shows us the JSON form. And we could have a section that contains a text element, and this is an example of the markdown. So it's got some formatting here that uses the markdown format. There are also, stick in a divider here just for fun. We'll stick in an image just to see what that looks like. A context item, which has like the smaller text with a small image. So it's just a different type of formatting for content. And then there's actions where you can add buttons, date pickers, checkboxes, radio buttons, time pickers, select boxes. There's a lot of form controls available. Now, some of these things aren't as useful in a message as they might be in like a modal, for example, and you have like a form you're having someone fill out within your app. But this just gives an example of the JSON required to produce some of these complex messages. And when you create an app and you want to have this kind of complex formatting, basically your output of your application is going to be to build up this these types of JSON documents. So Slack's block kit builder is a tool that can help you with that, or at least help you understand what it will look like, or providing examples of the formatting.
That's just so then you can copy paste the markdown, right? You can't like build a component from there, right?
Say that again.
The intent of this block kit builder is like you compose it using a GUI and then you copy paste this JSON into your code somewhere.
Yeah, or you're producing this JSON on your own. But like,
Okay.
yeah, like with these, like a button, for example, is like a specific type of thing that you can send to Slack, and then Slack renders this. So there's no like custom controls. Like everything that you can do has an example here, and that's all you're able to do.
I think what you're asking is that, like, I think this is just mainly just for previewing, so you know what the JSON is supposed to look like that you need to send.
Yeah.
Because the last time I did any Slack development, they didn't have this tool, so you just had to like send payloads to see what it was going to look like.
Right. Yeah. You could create like a webhook and to a channel that you own and just send stuff and see what it looks like. So they have a button here that you can send it right to one of your workflows, or you can copy it, copy the JSON and put it where you need it to go in your app.
Yeah, I didn't know about that. That's super helpful.
It's very cool. Yes. It helped me immensely when I was trying to figure out how to do some of this stuff. So that's surfaces and blockkit and markdown. Now there's different kinds of interactions that you can do from Slack. Our very first example was a / command, but there's a lot other ones. There's things called shortcuts, which can be done from a global context, or it can be done for a specific message. There's the interactive components, which you saw some of those in the BlockKit builder. Those form controls, when you interact with them, they will send payloads to your application, including there's the one called block suggestion, and that's for a like an autocomplete dropdown. So you can have custom options that your app provides to that control. Then there's modals, and then you can get payloads sent to you from Slack when a modal is submitted or when it's closed. And then there's also the event stream that you can tap into. So you have all the events. We'll get to that more as we look at some examples. The thing that is, I think, most difficult about all of these is that you have to keep track in your mind of what context each of these things carries with them. What do I mean by context? I mean, like, what information is associated with that interaction. So, I mean, every interaction has the context of what application it is. Some have, depending on your setup, what could have context of what enterprise org you're in. So that's for when you have an enterprise setup. Some interactions will have the context of a team or workspace. I think most of them actually do, because they're happening within a particular workspace. And Slack uses the term workspace and team interchangeably. So I might switch back and forth between that word. Some will have a user context and some won't. Like, some events are not triggered by the current user, they're triggered by something else. So they might not have a user context. Some will have a channel context, which is the current channel or conversation you're in. A conversation and a channel are slightly different. A conversation would include also like private messages or group messages. And then some will have the context of a message or a view, meaning like a modal. So depending on the interaction, you'll get IDs for all of these different things or some of them. And that's kind of the hardest part to keep track of, and why you spend a lot of time in the Slack documentation when you're building apps. And so when an interaction happens, your app gets called, and then you react to that in some way. So the main thing that you have to do every time is ACK. For every interaction, you have to ACK, because that tells Slack that you received that request that had the payload. Then you can choose to do other things in addition to that, such as post a message or respond to an existing message or add a message to the existing conversation, open, update, or close a modal, update the app home, which that's something I haven't showed you yet. Use other Slack APIs. There's lots of them. Use third-party APIs or anything else that your code wants to do. It's your code, so you can do whatever. But the one requirement is that you have to ACK. So let's click through an existing app that I've made, and then I can kind of point out where all the different surfaces and interaction points happen. So I think we can just use this, use this same channel that I was looking at before. So let me change over here to Slack again. All right, are we looking at Slack?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So that first type of thing that we saw before was a command, a slash command. So my 8-ball app has a slash command. And when I don't provide any arguments, it gives me a list of subcommands that I can do. So subcommands are not a specific thing that exist, but you can parse any text that comes into your command following the slash command name, and then you can treat it however you want. So in this app, I've treated whatever the next word is as a subcommand. So if I do this one, we'll see some different things happen. So that one has triggered a modal to appear. So this is a modal surface in which I've added a form control here. What is our question? So it's a magic 8-ball. What do we want to ask it?
Will Bitcoin hit 100K?
Most likely, you said.
Yes.
So that interaction where I clicked submit did a submission of the form, and then it updated the modal with some different content. And then including this button here, which says try again. So if I click on this one, this is a block action type of interaction. And it also updates the modal with a new answer. So you can keep on trying again until you get the answer you want.
Are each of those interactions a different endpoint?
So you can, I'll actually show you how we're going to do an app where we set it up. So you'll see.
Okay.
But there is a certain amount of control over that you have as you set it up. In this particular case, I have set them all to the same URL so that I could hit them through like a front controller. So another action you can take in a modal is closing. So you can tell when you create a modal, you can tell it whether you want to receive a notice when it's closed. And that's called a view closed interaction. And we'll look at this other command that I have here, 8-ball choose. Oops, that was the same one again. Pressed enter too early. Here we go. So this one's got one of those drop downs with autocomplete. So this did a block suggestion call to my app, and my app was able to return custom choices. And then otherwise in that, it looks the same as our previous interaction. So let's look at other things besides slash commands. So Slack has this little lightning icon here, which provides a context menu, among which are shortcuts that apps have defined. So I can go to here and I can use the magic 8-ball shortcut, and then this triggers that same action I did with the command, but through a shortcut. So you can provide ways to do things that don't require typing. That is a global shortcut, and so it does not have any particular channel or message context with it. But if you have a message, now you can use a message shortcut, which I've also set up on this app. And so it's on the message context menu. And then that does have message context. So it receives the content of the message so that it can do something with it. So in that case, I printed the question back with the 8-ball's answer. So let's see, that is those two. Let me pull up my other notes here. Okay, so we also have the app home, and this actually includes an event as well. So every app, if you enable it through your app configuration, will have an entry here in this apps menu. So when you go there, that triggers an event to the application called app home opened, and then you can then use the Slack API to update the app home surface. So this is the app home surface between me, the user, and the application. And so you can put whatever BlockKit content you want onto this page. So I have a button here that triggers, again, that same modal. And then also, an app can act as kind of a user of sorts, and you can talk to it directly. And so I'll send it a message and it will reply to me here. And that is using another event to listen for messages that are sent to the app's user. So that is a whole bunch of different ways that you can interact with an app and with the app responding. So any questions about any of that? All right, let me jump back over. We'll kind of go a little bit more into detail on what some of those, how those interactions work. All right, back on the presentation. Let's go deeper into reactions. So one of the things we didn't do with our really simple app was authentication. So Slack has an authentication protocol that your app can implement so that you can verify that requests coming to your application are actually from Slack and not some other random app thing. And then there's also authentication the other way when we call Slack's APIs. So there's different credentials for each one. So our application, we use something called the signing key that we can get from our app configuration. And it is scoped to our app. And we use that when we authenticate Slack's requests to us. And then Slack authenticates our request to them using a bot token. A bot token is scoped to our app, but it's also scoped to the team or workspace. And that's what the OAuth flow is needed for. Now, when we did our Hello World app at the beginning, we didn't have to implement an OAuth flow because the default workspace for an application doesn't have to do that. Slack will trust that workspace and assumes that your workspace trusts the app is more like it, and will generate a bot token for you to use without having to implement OAuth. If you have an app that you are using with multiple workspaces or that you're preparing to distribute or use in an enterprise setting, you do have to implement the OAuth flow. That is something we were not going to cover tonight because that's a whole thing in and of itself. So what does a request look like when it actually comes to our app? Here's the juicy details, all right? So this is a request from a / command happening. And it's got some parts that we need to take a look at, especially when we're authenticating. So first of all, there's a header called a custom header x Slack signature. We need that one. That is a a signature that we can validate using our signing key. It also has the request timestamp, and we will want to check this to make sure that it is close to right now and not old or in the future. And then there's the request body. And we'll get to what the body actually looks like in a minute. But at the point that you're doing authentication, the content of the body doesn't matter, but you do need to have it because it is part of the signing process. And this is the signing process as simplified as I could get it to fit on a slide. So you need to get that Slack signature from the headers. You need to get the request timestamp from the header, and you need to get the body content. Once you have those, you can create the string that needs to be signed, and that is in this following format. Currently, Slack signature protocol, there's only V0. There's no other versions. So in the future, this V0 might need to be different, but right now it is always V0. Oops. So you have V0 colon, and then the timestamp goes there, colon, and the body content goes there. So once we have that string, then we can sign it, and it uses the hash HMAC algorithm with SHA, or function with the SHA-256 algorithm. You sign that string, and with the signing key that you got from your application. So this would be something that you would pass in like in an environment variable. And then you also want to prefix V0 equals, because if you remember, the actual header value has this little prefix on it. So you want to make sure that's attached to the front of the signature. Then the validation, you want to validate the timestamp. So basically using absolute value here to basically just make sure that this timestamp is within 5 minutes of right now. So that's what they recommend, is that as a 5-minute grace period to account for any kind of clock skew. And then we use the hash equals algorithm to compare the signature that we received from them with the signature that we generated ourselves. And so if that matches, then this is a valid message from Slack. Any questions on that? Or comments or
that
anything?
signing key you'll get from Slack, or is that something you set and then you have to send over to Slack?
It's from Slack. So
okay.
I can actually show you that really quick instead of delaying that until later. But when you go to your apps, I think it's in here, basic information, you have a signing key here, and then you can click that and copy it. And then you just stick that in like a environment variable, or however you manage your credentials.
Cool.
So that's a shared secret that you and Slack have.
And it looks like they have a separate one for the interaction. So when you're talking back and forth to them, and then a separate one that they're going to use to sign it. Because I see the client secret and the signing secret, right?
So yeah, I can cover that. So the client ID and client secret actually for the OAuth flow only.
Okay.
So once you implement OAuth flow, you need those. Until you do, you don't need them at all. The verification token here is actually legacy. So you don't need that at all if you're developing a new application. But the key that you use to talk to the API is different. And that one is in the permissions here. That's called the bot token. And so that would be this one. So if you're calling the Slack API, you need to copy this one and use that as the bearer token when you're talking to the API. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thank you.
So, oh yeah. So any more questions on the algorithm for authentication. It's actually a pretty easy one. It's I've seen worse.
This one looks really similar to how Stripe does theirs for webhook validation.
Yeah.
HMACs are pretty common for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. All right. So going back to, let's look at the actual payload now. Going back to this one, the important bits here are looking at the content type and then the actual content itself. And it's going to be different, of course, based on the different type of interaction. I'm sure there are some lovely historical reasons why there are 4 different payload types. I'm guessing they all occurred over the series of many years. So let's look at these. So slash commands have their own little format here. None of these formats are complex by any means, but they're just different. You have to account for that difference. It's going to come to you as a URL encoded payload. And all the data for that command is just right there in the top level. So command /foo text, that's everything after the command will be there. Things like the user ID, the team ID, and other things about the context of that / command are all there. So you just parse this using parse string function. It's an easy way to do that. And you have all the command information. Then events are different. Events are JSON. And so they have this structure where there's kind of a little envelope on the outside with the type equals event. There's some other context in the envelope. And then the actual event data is inside of this event key. And there's different fields here depending on what the specific event type is. So those are things you have to look up in the documentation in order to know what's going to actually be there. And now events also have a verification step. So when we'll actually look at this when we look at our next app. And you have to put in a URL and it sends a quick challenge to your app, and then you have to respond to that. And so its format is like this. Basically just has that data, that's it. And then everything else, which includes block actions, block suggestions, shortcuts, modal submissions, they all are in this format. They are URL encoded as well, but there's only one top level element called payload. And then that is equal to a URL encoded JSON blob that has everything else. So you have to grab that from the URL encoded fields, and then you have to JSON decode that value to get the actual event data or the payload for those interactions. So an easy way to normalize that is here. Oh, I was going to point out this. This is the one that really I love the most. So every one of these has a type field. So type event, type URL verification, type shortcut. Command does not have type. You just have to know that it's a command. So here's some code that can do the normalization. So if it's URL encoded, then you can use that parse string function to parse the body into an array, an associative array called payload. But if it's one of those other types that's not a / command, it's going to have that top level payload key, and then we have to decode that JSON. And that is actually what we really want. We don't care about the payload key. We want the stuff that's in the payload key. And if it's a command and there's no type specified, we can just assume that it's a command. Another way we could do this is to look for the command value instead. That might be a little bit safer, but I don't think they'll be adding any more payloads that don't have a type anymore, because that would be silly. And then if it's not URL encoded, then that means it's JSON, and we just JSON decode it, and that's for events. So even though they're all kind of different, you can normalize them pretty easily and end up with an associative array with all the data. And we're going to upgrade our Hello World app in just a minute here. So the ACKs, we've talked a little bit about ACKs. When we, the relationship of what an ACK is to what PHP is doing is, the ACK is our response, whereas the payload is what comes in the request. Now, the requirement for being a Slack app that works is that you have to ACK for every payload. The nice thing about PHP is that we implicitly always have a response as a PHP application, because the request and response lifecycle is kind of implicit in the way that PHP is run when it's run through our regular means of having like FPM and stuff. So an ACK is without content is really just a 200 response with an empty body, and that we kind of just do that by default as a PHP application. The catch to ACKs is that there's a 3-second timeout. So you have to ACK back to Slack in 3 seconds or less. Otherwise, Slack assumes that you did not get the request. In the case of events, they'll try to resend them. In the case of everything else, they just say, it didn't work. And sometimes they show an error message, but sometimes they don't, depending on the type of interaction. So if the thing that we're doing happens to be too slow for that 3-second timeout, then that's where we have to get into things like queues, pub/sub, other threads, because we don't really have async stuff built naturally into PHP. So we have to rely on setting up some other kind of infrastructure or extensions to support that. So from a PHP developer perspective, we really want to try to do whatever we're doing in 3 seconds or less.
So that ACK is not necessarily the actual thing you want to do. It's just a
correct.
Yeah. Okay.
So sometimes it is.
Yeah. Sure.
And sometimes it isn't. And that's what I was going to show you here. So again, if we separate our types of interaction to commands, events, and everything else, there's some different things that we can do with ACK. So every type of interaction, no matter what it is, an empty ACK, the 200 response with no body, is valid. That tells Slack, I got it. And I'll either do something with what I got or I won't. Doesn't matter. Slack doesn't care. But you can do something with at the time of ACKing in some cases. So for commands, as we did with our cheap little Hello World app, we echoed some text. And that actually gets picked up in the case of slash commands as you want me to show this text. So Slack turns that into a message. We could also have echoed out blockkit JSON, and it would have rendered that instead. That's definitely preferable to just a piece of text. For events, an ACK is simply just, I got it. There's absolutely nothing you can send back in the ACK that will make any difference. But when you do that, when you have that first initial URL verification step, you do have to ACK back the challenge value. So we'll see that in action in a minute. For everything else, usually you are going to ACK with nothing, but there are some special cases. So in the case of the block suggestion interaction, which is the one that's getting options to display in the autocomplete dropdowns, you ACK with those options in your response. And then there's also a set of things that you can do for when a modal is submitted. You can do a response action in your app with some things. We're going to look at that some more in a few minutes. So let's go back to our Hello World app, though. We're going to upgrade this with some of the code that we just wrote in the slides. Okay. Make this bigger again. It makes all my stuff disappear every time. Okay, app's still running. So that's fine. Yep, okay. So we started with this. What we'll do now, I didn't show this version, but we could have done this to echo JSON back, but it's basically exactly the same as what we did before. What we're going to do is do a little bit more advanced, and so we can include the authentication step, and then actually look at the payload a little bit. So I'm getting the Slack signing key from the environment. I am using that authentication code. I have a little bit of extra checks here to make sure things aren't empty, but we would be expecting to get these from the request signature and the timestamp, and then we sign the request with the HMAC, validate the timestamp and the signature. And then we move on to processing the payload, which that's the code snippet that we looked at for normalizing the payload. So that's there too. And then we can actually do something. So I'm going to log whatever, just the payload type, so that we can see what payload happens when we do things. And then if it's a command, we'll respond with some blockkit for fun. If it's the URL verification, which is that pre-step for being able to handle events, then we're going to pull the challenge value out of the payload and respond with that, because that's how Slack knows that we're good to go for processing events. Did anything here not make sense that you would like to ask a question about? Otherwise, we'll jump over to our configuration. In the Slack website. Jump back over there. It says tricky jumping through all these different windows.
Still see your editor right now.
Oh yeah, okay. There we go. All right, so we're in our Hello World app. We upgraded our code already, and our app's still running, so that should be good. Now we need to go around and enable features for this app. So first, let's go back to where that slash command was, because we're going to borrow our URL here. And we're going to go to the interactivity and shortcuts. And we're going to put that URL in there. So that will be for any block actions or shortcuts. Also, there's this one for loading options, which we're not really supporting in this right now, but we'll just stick it in there. And then we can create a shortcut. Hello. One thing about shortcuts and / command names is that they are not namespaced. So within a workspace, you could have collisions between different apps that you install or develop. And I think last one wins, I think is how it works. So it's kind of weird. So you want to try and make something that's going to be unique.
You're saying if you have two apps that both expose like a command that's like /hello, then
Yeah.
Okay.
Whichever one was installed most recently wins.
Gotcha. Interesting.
And we'll also do a message shortcut. So the global shortcut's the one from the lightning menu. A message one's from the message context window. So the message shortcut. All right. And then also we have events. So we have / commands, we have the interactivity, and then the third place where you can put in a URL is events. So this is, we're going to find out if our challenge worked. It didn't, of course. Oh, that's a bummer. Internal server error. Oh, well, I know why. We never gave ourselves the signing key, right? So we don't have any authentic, or we don't have the environment variable in there. So let's do that. You need the signing key. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to change my screen just for this, but I'm going to run that PHP local server command again, except I'm just going to set the environment variable / signing key when I run it, and hopefully that should do it. And hopefully it doesn't kill my Ngrok.
I don't think it should.
All right, well, let's try this again. Oh, that's not it. I need the URL. Okay, boom, there we go. So now I was able to authenticate that request and respond back with the challenge. So now it says, okay, you can receive events now. So now we can subscribe to events. And so probably the easiest one to trigger is the message event. Oh, I'm not sure why it's not showing up. Message. Oh, is it just It's not IM. Message groups, message channels. Yeah.
You don't get the body of people's direct messages, do you? I assume.
Oh, you do, sir.
For the entire, without their, like just anybody in the entire workspace?
Only if they trigger a message to the bot, right? Or
Depends how you have it configured.
True.
So when we do this, see this required scope right here. When you save this, it's going to tell us we have to reinstall this app. Now, when we're on our default workspace, that's an easy step. But if you have like an app that's in the Slack app directory, it has to get reapproved if you change the scopes that are required. So Slack reviews the scopes that you request for your application. And so that way, the idea is you're not requesting access to things that your app doesn't really need. So if your app doesn't really need to read messages, and this is just messages in channels, not private messages. That's a different scope.
And to your point, if your app wasn't, if I tried to install your app in the workspace, it's not the default, I would get a list of the permissions it needs, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so when you install an app, you can review the scopes as well, which is what whoever is the Slack administrator for your workspace would be doing that.
So it's possible that some of the apps installed in my Slack workspace by the admin have access to all of my direct messages then.
That is true. Yeah.
Possible, yes.
Yeah,
I think
admins have access to everything in Slack.
So it's changed a bit. You can actually, as a user, go somewhere in your settings and see what access your admins have. It says, it'll tell you if they have that access or not. I forget where. I can find it if I wanted, but there's a page in your organization settings under your, like when you're logged in under your account, that says what permissions they have and can see.
And this is actually better than it used to be too, because it used to be that there was like one scope for a bot user, and they broke everything out into finer grained scopes.
I just always assume that my company can always read my emails and messages on Slack.
I was more concerned about like if they installed some third-party shit from, that they thought was cool.
That's sending off your messages somewhere else. Yeah.
Right. Oh yeah, that's totally fair point. And maybe they don't realize that it's doing that. Yeah.
So things to think about right there for sure.
Whether or not China is installing apps on your Slack channel.
Or some other startup is doing this to steal your business secrets.
You want to make sure to set up so that all apps that are installed have to be approved. So you can check those scopes. One of my regular activities is checking scopes of things people want to install.
So, yes, that is a good practice. One of the nice things about Ngrok is that it gives you kind of a UI to actually see your traffic. So we can actually look and see.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's nice, especially in this case, because when you're learning to work on this platform, you want to know what the heck is being sent to your application. So like this is, what got sent in that URL verification payload, and then we responded with the challenge that it gave us. Before we errored because we didn't have that credential. This is what the slash command that came through when we said hey earlier. So it has the different contexts, so your app ID, channel name, what command it was, response URL, we'll get to that in a minute. Oh, it's getting late. The team ID, the tokens are deprecated. Trigger IDs, this is important for modals. user. So all that stuff's coming through. Then if like we start clicking around with some of the stuff that we just set up with our app, like this one, say hello. That was a global shortcut. We should see that come in here. So there's that top level payload key with the JSON all in there. So we can see that. If we type a message foobar, that should trigger an event. Should. We'll see if that happens or not. But we can also do that message shortcut, say hello there. That should give us some new entries, I would think. Trying to see if I'm getting those. You set those up, right?
What do you mean by set them up?
I saw something pop up on Slack right when you were moving it off the screen. Is there an error popping up or something?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. Let's try again in this context menu. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. Where did it send that?
Do you see the request coming in on the Ngrok terminal? Does it show like it popping up there? I would expect it to show up here.
That's what I'd expect too. That's why I was looking for it.
Check your URL configurations again then maybe.
Yeah.
I think you spun the server up again, so probably that has the old URL.
Yeah, let's I'll just start a new Ngrok, see if that's any better. All right, so I'm going to change this. Okay, that one. Interactivity. I'm going to change that one and this one. And our slash command, you have to kind of go and change all of these, which is fun. Slash commands are one by one, which is the biggest pain if you want to have them be the same.
There's no way to like.
There's no way to automate it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and there's no central location for it all.
Nope. All right, so let's try again. Foobar Baz. And we'll throw in a hello. Oh, there we go. There's two. So here's this one. Oh, that's the URL verification thing. That's it's not taking my events in, which is weird. And oh, it's actually this one. That's why. I have another Hello World app. So here's the message action right there. So that is the message shortcut. So we saw that one come through. So, okay, that gives us an idea of how this kind of works though. And hopefully that should see some of these, foundational pieces of the app development coming together with that. All right, we are a little short in time, so I'm gonna come back to the presentation. So I want to show off some code that I've written that will help, but also make sure we cover a couple of the other points here. So what did we accomplish this time? We now have auth. We now have some form of payload specific logic, though it's still not anything particularly useful at this point. What's next? We're gonna have to do things with these payloads. So let's go even deeper into reactions. So one of the easiest things we can do is to respond to a conversation based off of some kind of interactions happening. So several of the interactions will include a field called response URL, commands, message shortcuts, and some block actions. So anything that has a message context has the context of the conversation and will have a response URL. The reason I say some block actions is because you can have form controls in a message, but you can also have form controls in a modal. So in the latter case, you would not get a response URL. The way that you use the response webhook is easy. You just post to the URL that it gives you. You post a message text or the blockkit JSON, and it will show up in the conversation that is related to the original message that was interacted with. There's no auth needed on that webhook, but they do expire. So you shouldn't share them because there's no auth, but luckily they do expire. You can only use a single response URL webhook up to 5 times and for up to 30 minutes before it is no longer valid. So that is one thing that you can do in addition to hacking. What's nice is because these last longer than 3 seconds, responding to a conversation is something that you can do like asynchronously. Then we have the Slack API. There's tons of things that you can do with the Slack API, but I only wanted to call a few of them that I would say are critical for basic reactions. And that would be on the right side there, chat post message. That's a pretty critical one. That's how you would post a message when you don't have a response URL and you need to have the channel to be able to do that. Views open, views push, and views update all have to do with controlling modals, and views publish, it has to do with updating the app home content. And calling the API is pretty easy. It's not a complicated API. It's an RPC style API. Basically everything is post, and anything you send to it, you can just send it as JSON. The bot token, which we saw earlier, that it needs to go as a bearer token in the authorization header so that Slack can authenticate you. Different APIs require different scopes, just like events. So in order for your app to call certain APIs, you have to have that scope set up. And what is nice is that the API docs are helpful in this regard. For example, this is the API doc for a post message, and it tells you what scope that you need. So you need chat write scope in order to use your bot token. And then it has all the arguments, potential arguments you include, including, the blocks for sending blockkit. So the API documentation is pretty good and has the scope information, which is great because otherwise that would be really hard to know. And the API is supported by a lot of clients and SDKs in different languages. So there's one for PHP that is called, actually, I think I have the link later, so I'll just show it then. But there is a pretty good one for PHP that is based off of the Slack API's Open API spec document.
Is for the URLs, is there a way to put like a dev URL and a production URL, or do you end up having to create 2 separate apps to maintain?
Great question. So the official answer from every Slack person that I've talked to is you make different apps for different environments, which is a very fun thing when you also consider the names are global for commands and shortcuts.
Ooh.
So yes,
Nice.
it's kind of tricky there, but that is the landscape as it is today. So for modals, we saw some of those when we were clicking around the 8-ball app. Modals are great in a lot of situations, especially with things like shortcuts, because it gives you a chance to get information from the user before you start posting messages places. And so when the user does some kind of direct interaction with Slack, there's typically a trigger ID parameter or field in your payload. So that's true of commands, that's true of both global and message shortcuts, and that's true of all block actions. There'll be a trigger ID, and you use that views open API to open a modal. So when you need to look that one up, it's in their API documentation too, and see that the trigger ID is a required parameter. And the view is the content of the modal. So that's a BlockKit modal definition there. The tricky part about trigger ID is that it also expires after 3 seconds. So it has the same life cycle as an ACK does, which means if you are taking too long to ACK, then you might not be able to do a modal either. A trick that I've seen people do is that you can open a modal, but with like a loading message, and then you can come back and update it once whatever you're doing that took a long time is done. So modals are kind of cool because there's different states. And you can modify them in 2 different ways. You have those 3 APIs, but also, if you remember, I talked about response actions being a part of an ACK for the view submission interaction. So you can actually ACK with some information about what you want the modal to do after it's submitted, instead of having to call an API. So it's a little bit, I think it's a lot easier to do it that way. But again, that's if you're within the 3-second timeout. So if you go outside of that, then that's a use case for the APIs. So you open, and you can only open one from the API with the trigger ID. So once you open a modal, you can push another modal onto it. So you can kind of stack modals up to 3, or you can update one, which just updates the current one. If you have more on your stack, if you close a modal, then it just goes back to the one that was under it. Or you can choose to clear the modals, the whole stack. So that's the difference between close and clear. Close closes just the top of the stack. Clear closes all of them. And I'll leave it as an exercise to you as to why you would want to stack modals. I'm sure you could come up with something. What's also cool with response actions is that you can list errors. So when you get a view submission payload, it's going to have the values that are in all the form fields. And then you can return an errors response action with a list of the fields that are not valid with a description of why. So you can show little error messages. And that's how you would, provide that kind of helpful user experience on making sure your data is valid. And then there's the app home. So when a user visits the app home, that triggers an event called the app home opened event. And so you'll have to, your app needs to listen for that event to know when it should publish the app home, for at least for the first time. And then anytime you update the app home, whether it's the first time or subsequent times, it's always through the views publish API. And that's just how that one works. You can look up that one on your own. And after, anything you do with that app homepage, it's really up to your app. So if you have state that you want to manage for that, or if you want to control the frequency of when that's updated, that's all on, it's all controlled by your app. Okay, so what are the tools that we have? We have that configuration dashboard. That's how we configure things, get our credentials. We have Block Kit Builder, showed that. We have the Slack API. Here's the name of the client. Jolly Code Slack PHP API. That's really the only client that I found that seemed to be good. So there were like 50 other very incomplete ones that existed. So if you find something better, let me know. But that one's pretty good. It follows the open API spec that Slack publishes and makes relevant transformations on it of things that are missing or things that don't make sense for PHP. So that's fun. One of them being that there's a timestamp parameter that's treated as a number by some things, and it's got to the microsecond precision. So like that gets messed up if you don't treat it as a string. Fun times. We have the Slack documentation, and then we have frameworks. So this is where we get into some cool things. So Slack produces a framework called Bolt, and it's made by that slide. I don't know what happened with that slide. Bolt is made by Slack, and they have a JavaScript version, which is pretty cool. And then there's Java and Python as well. Haven't looked too much at the Java one, but the Python one looked really cool too. They're all kind of try to follow the same patterns, just adapted to the programming language. And when you are creating an application with Bolt, it kind of looks like this. You set up the app with the kind of the base configurations that it needs. Then you have kind of like a router type interface, like you would see in Express or with micro frameworks in PHP, where you have the interaction type and then the identifier for the interaction, and then what it's supposed to do. So, and then you start the app and it goes. So I think the Bolt one by default actually uses Express under the hood, and it supports all the different interaction patterns and has an API client built in as well. So I've been working on something similar for PHP because they do not have one for PHP.
Have you heard of Botman?
They do have Botman, but it is very focused on making bots.
That's true. That's fair.
And this one is a general purpose for all the interaction types. So if you are trying to make a chat bot, you should take a look at the Botman library. If you are making something that's not necessarily a chat bot, then you're going to have a harder time finding something. So what I'm trying to do with my library is make something that is following the same types of patterns as Bolt. So you can basically use kind of that same type of interface where there's methods for each of the interaction patterns, the identity for that thing. So if it's a command, you have the /command name. If it's a shortcut, you have the shortcut name. If it's an event, you have the event type. If it's a block action, you have the block ID or the action ID. And then there's a function where you have this context object, which has all the things that you can do, as well as access to the payload available to it. So I was going to have us build an app together, but it took way too long to get to this point. So I'll show you some code for what I have right now with that application. So let me track that down. Give me just a minute. All right, and we already actually clicked through the app, so you kind of know what it does. It's an 8-ball.
You supposed to be sharing something other than your slides?
In just a second. All right, let me cut over to that now. All right, we got code up now.
Yep.
All right, cool. So when I showed you the app, I showed you that I had kind of like subcommands under the same app. So that's something that I built, because when I was doing some work on a Slack app at work, we kind of had we were building like a CLI app as a Slack app. And so my first iteration of this pattern was actually using the Symfony console package and then running a Slack app through that. But it does a whole lot of extra things that aren't great. So my new version does not do that and is more simplified. But it allows you to basically have subcommands, and then we can do different things with the context. So if you do /8ball ask, then what it does first is it gets the payload. I'm stripping off that ask word from the beginning. And then if there's no other text here, if there is text here, it's not empty, then I read the question in and create an answer for it really quickly, though it's not that important. The way that the question works is that it validates that the question starts with one of these words, which are all the words in English that result in a question that you have to say yes or no to. And then it just generates a random answer from the standard 8-ball bank of answers in response to that question. So nothing particularly complicated there, no natural language processing or anything like that.
Man, I was expecting more.
So then
Jeremy, constantly just disappointing us.
Oh, I know, right? Ooh. So there's, with a command, one of the easiest things to do is just to act with your message back. This is using some of that Slack markdown with a quote there and an answer. then I have it so that if you don't provide a question in the actual command, then it opens that modal up to ask to have you type in a question. So the framework has these utilities. So the Modals utility open, and what it does is that it looks at the payload and pulls that trigger ID out of the payload for you and calls the API. So you don't have to juggle a bunch of that stuff. And this is just a helper that I made specifically for the app, which uses another library that I'm working on for generating valid block kits with a Fluent interface. So there's modal, and it's got functions for all the different fields and things that you can add onto the modal. And then ultimately that generates block kit JSON to pass to the views open API. And then in the case of the choose subcommand, it's opening a different one that has the select box. So that one's got this select box called choices. Yes. Maybe it's question form. I can't remember which one of these is the actual action ID. We'll find out by looking at the other code. So to respond to that, oh, it's choices. Okay. To respond to that request for options, I have a route here for block suggestions with the choices block action ID. And then there's a helper in the framework for passing options back in the ACK. So it makes stuff like that kind of easy. Now this one's a dumb version because it's always passing back a static set of options, but you could take in the payload and get the value, and this would tell you what they typed into the box so far, so that you can then adjust the options like an actual autocomplete. So you could use that if you were treating it that way. Let's see some other things. Here's a global shortcut. Sorry, I'm removing all these M's because I was namespacing them. Global shortcut opens a modal message shortcut. This one's responding. So this is using the response URL that gets, and this utility in the framework pulls that out of the payload automatically and then sends the text to that response URL. Then there's view submission. That's receiving a modal once it's data once it's submitted, and so you can get the state out of there, and then you can do things with it. So the view utility is what helps you do response actions. So I can say, hey, if they typed in a question that was not a yes or no question, which is what this is doing, then I can send back an error for that field. And there's an error message that comes out of this object, and it will pass that out to the user. I think maybe I can show that in Slack would be useful to see. So let's see, where's this? The message shortcut. Oh, view submission. Okay. So if I just do the shortcut.
We still see code.
Oh, my bad. Okay. So I did the shortcut down here. It popped up and opened this modal. And then if I don't do a yes or no question, like if I just write foo, then it's going to send an error back. Say your question must be yes or no. And that's how that manifests in Slack when you return the errors as a response action. So I thought that's kind of cool. That's a thing that's kind of built into how modals work.
It was really thorough.
And we can also get notifications when a view is closed. There's not really many actions you can take with that except just updating some kind of state in your application. So I just have this logging. And block suggestion, we covered that one. Block action is like pressing a button or other interactive components. So we can respond to that. Uses there when you construct a block kit, you set these IDs when you construct the actual message or modal, and then that's why I'm using these particular values here, is because that's what I picked when I wrote out that modal. So like this says 8-ball, try again, and let's see, I have that code somewhere. Here it is. Here's the button that says try again. I actually forgot to update this. This would be there. Okay. Then there's events. Events start to get on the more complicated side because they kind of are kind of like a cast a wide net initially. So there are I have some utilities in the framework where you can filter things. So for an app home event, I only really want this if it's my app. I think actually they might do that for you. So this one's actually a better example. I had something where you could click add a reaction that looked like an 8-ball. And then it would throw an event, and then the 8-ball would answer your question if it was on a message where you reacted with an 8-ball icon. And so this filters out only reactions that are 8-ball and only on things that are messages. So you kind of have to do a lot of filtering on the events before you like add logic to it. Otherwise it gets kind of crazy. And so this does some API calls that actually calls the conversation history to acquire the message text, because reacting to something does not give you that message text in the event. I have to go get it myself and then check if it's a question, a yes or no question, and then I can say something, and say is a shortcut to the chat post message API. So I can say something into that channel and even onto that as a reply to that specific message by using the thread ID. So there's, and this is using that Jolly Code client that I mentioned. So yeah, there's all sorts of things you can do. The goal of the framework is just to make things a lot easier and to not have to deal with some of the boilerplate. Because as you saw in this presentation, there's a bit of boilerplate that you have to deal with. It does auth automatically, assuming you have those environment tokens in your environment, and it's just stuff that built in. So if you ever want to chat more about this with me, definitely reach out. But we are like at time tonight, so if any of you need to drop off right now, I totally understand. But I'm going to cut back to the slides here just for a couple more. But we're done with like the demo parts because we're getting late. All right, so we didn't get to build the 8-ball app, but we did get to look at how some of that code would work within the framework. What did we accomplish with this? We actually were able to work with some of the APIs, response webhooks, and we were able to kind of have an example of every type of interaction within that code. So that's why I wrote the code the way that I did, is to actually exercise every interaction type. And what's next from here when we're building apps? Well, there's a lot of things I didn't cover. The details of the OAuth flow, OAuth scopes, we just kind of barely touched on that. There's another type of token called user token, which is like a bot token, but it's actually for impersonating a user, and users have to go through a specific OAuth flow for that. The process of just storing the bot and user tokens and getting the right one is tricky. So you do have to implement some kind of data store for holding on to those credentials, so that when you get interactions from a particular workspace or a particular user, you can grab the right token to call the APIs with. I did not talk about making your app ready for distribution or for enterprise orgs. There's extra things you need to do there to support that. There's a whole nother surface type that we didn't touch on called the workflow step, and a whole nother feature in Slack called workflows. And that's another cool thing that I think is mostly for enterprise Slack. So that's one reason why I haven't touched on it too much, because I don't really have accounts set up to work with it at the moment. There's tons more event types, tons more APIs to learn about. There's a whole nother type of interaction pattern outside of HTTP called socket mode. And the way that you process the payloads in that case is different, and the way you handle authentication is different. So we didn't touch on that, and that's like a whole nother thing. Once you have the authentication, the payload normalization done, then the rest of it works kind of the same. And then there's legacy stuff in Slack. There were different ways of sending messages and doing modals prior to BlockKit that are still possible but are highly discouraged. There was a whole nother set of APIs called the real-time messaging API, I think, and that's deprecated in favor of the regular API, and I guess using socket mode. I don't know. I haven't done anything with that in the past, so I'm not too knowledgeable on that. So there's tons of here, and on top of all that, nuances everywhere. So I've been working on various things of Slack app nature for like, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, and I run into weird stuff a lot. So the documentation is definitely your friend, and they have a Slack channel called community.slack.com, and that's a great place to go when you have questions, because they have all their outward facing developers that are there that can answer questions. Thanks for coming tonight. That was a lot of information and took longer than I was wanting it to. But like I said, I had a disclaimer at the beginning that this was the first time I've ever given a presentation on this. And there's a lot of complicated stuff in there. But hopefully this gives you an idea, if you are wanting to get into Slack app development, that you have kind of some idea of how it will work, how long it might take to get ramped up into it. And hopefully as I continue to work on those libraries, those will be something that can be useful to other people. Right now I do not have, they're just kind of in an alpha state, but I've been actively working on them over the past couple months. So thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you. This was really thorough.
Badass.
To learn a lot today.
Yeah, good stuff.
Did you link to that Slack framework that you're working on?
I did not. Let me drop that in the chat right now. I also post it on the meetup page in the comments in case you have to go. But I'll grab that right now because, yeah, I would love it if you guys took a look at that. I have, oh, where'd my chat go? There it is. This is the first link is the framework, and then the second link is there's a separate library that I was working on for the block kit abstraction. That one is in a more stable state right now. That one I would say is usable, whereas the other one is going to have more commits that break things. But cool. I hope that was interesting. I don't know how interesting that was.
No, that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It was great. Thank you.
It was hard switching between all those windows to look at Slack, look at the web traffic, look at the presentation. So sorry. Hard to keep up on that part. All right. In terms of the meetup, yeah, I don't know if anyone is planning on sticking around. It is getting late already. I'm going to be here for a few minutes, but I'm going to be eating while I'm still here. If you want to leave, totally welcome to that. Thank you for coming. And next month, we're having a presentation by Luther that's about Kubernetes and deploying PHP using Kubernetes. And that meetup is already posted. I believe you can RSVP to that one.
Cool. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go though.
All right. See you later.
Stay here. Good night.
Thanks.
Bye.
Well done.
Bye.
Everyone's dropping.
What was that?
Everyone's dropping.
Oh yeah. Well, it's late. It's past 9
It
already.
is.
Like this is, if we were in person, this would be the time where we would be drinking and eating.
Yeah,
Already did.
that was, you had a lot to go over.
Yeah, if I do that presentation somewhere else, I definitely need to figure out how to shorten it because that's a lot.
Yeah, I like your library though. That definitely, I don't know if you saw that in chat, but like we really got burned by libraries using JPHP. So
But using what?
a library that was built on using JPHP.
Oh gosh, it's pretty weird.
Every year or less, they like redo the whole framework, and any of your custom code, you have to rewrite it all to the new interfaces.
Yeah, so what I'm actually going to do, because right now my framework is depending on that library just because I didn't want to write a client, but I think there's only like 5 or 6 methods that it needs to use for the core functionality. So I'll probably just swing that built into the framework. And then if you need the bigger client, you can just bring that in as a dependency on your own. So
yeah. I mean, I think it's fine in this case, I guess, since the Jellycode guys are supporting that library and JPHP, they probably do the updates. But I mean, I was quick looking through their Git, and it's like, yeah, it was 500 file change set or whatever to update to JPHP 6. It's like, yeah, like everybody who depended on your library is just like lost all benefits from using generated code.
yeah, it's crazy.
Like, come on, you got to have some stability. You can't redo all your APIs every year.
Mm-mm.
You're like, oh, you could just stay on the old version. Well,